Let's take a look at some more paragraphs to examine effective paragraph development. This paragraph begins, "My supervisor at the restaurant where I work, Mrs. Dana Thompson, has been the most influential person in my life." We begin the paragraph with an effective topic sentence. We know that this paragraph is going to be about how Mrs. Dana Thompson has been influential in the writer's life. We can see the different ways this person has been influential by looking at the transition words, first and second. We know that the paragraph is going to cover two ways in which Mrs. Dana Thompson has had influence in this person's life. First, Mrs. Thompson has helped me make wise professional decisions. Well, the first item that we're going to cover clearly is professional decisions. While working at the restaurant, I was offered a job selling vacuum cleaners over the phone. The person offering me this position had told me that I could make $1,000 per week within a couple of months. When I told Mrs. Thompson about this opportunity, she sat down with me and listened to my description of the job. She told me that the job sounded like a scam and that she could not see how a person would become successful selling vacuum cleaners by phone. I took her advice and did not take the job. Later, I found out that the company was a fly-by-night scheme. In fact, it went out of business within the next year. I would not have succeeded in selling for that company, and I was glad that I had listened to Mrs. Thompson and stuck with my job at the restaurant. We have a chronological or time order explanation. While working at the restaurant, the writer talks about a job being offered to her, and then talking to Mrs. Thompson about the situation, she expresses her reservations about this job. She explains how she took the advice and was glad that she did, and she stayed with the restaurant. Going to the next situation, second, Mrs. Thompson has helped me make wise financial decisions. Well, we now know that this next example is going to be about finances, financial decisions. During one holiday season, I was considering investing all of my bonus money into the stock market. I even had 3 companies in mind. When I mentioned this to Mrs. Thompson, she sat down with me during my break and asked me about what type of research I had done into these companies. When I told her that I had found them on the internet while searching on Google, she advised me not to pursue this idea and instead to invest into a mutual fund, a fund which would be managed by professional investors who had the time to research companies. So we can see that we have proper time expressions. During one holiday season, I was considering this. When I mentioned this to Mrs. Thompson, she sat down with me. When I told her I had found them on the internet, she told me this. The writer continues, I took her advice and invested into a respectable fund. As a result, my portfolio has grown 30% over the last 2 years. The stock prices of the 3 companies I was considering investing into are all down from 10 to 40% of what they had been when I was making this decision. So the writer also shows the contrast between what happened to the companies she was considering in and what her portfolio has actually done, showing a good illustration of the wise financial decision she made and why this Mrs. Thompson influenced her life financially. My investment into those companies would have resulted in a significant loss, while following Mrs. Thompson's advice resulted in my getting my financial situation on more solid footing. So we have a contrast here. My investment into those companies would have done this, while following her advice resulted in this. Then we have our conclusion to the paragraph. Overall, Mrs. Dana Thompson is a jewel, a wise supervisor whose abilities range far beyond managing a restaurant. I'm grateful for the influence she has had on me. Notice the unity in this paragraph. All sentences relate to the influence that Mrs. Dana Thompson has had on the writer. No sentences stray from the topic. Notice the coherence in the paragraph. Not only does each influence start with a transition word like first or second, but within the explanation of these influences, we have appropriate sentence order, logic, and an easy-to-follow train of thought. For example, while working at the restaurant, I was offered this. When I told Mrs. Thompson, she sat down with me and told me this. I took her advice and didn't take the job. Later, I found out this. In fact, it went out of business. So we see expressions to indicate time, like while working at the restaurant, or when I told Mrs. Thompson, or later. We see expressions like in fact, which show that the writer is going to give more evidence of what she has already stated. In the next section, after the word second, we have the same principle. Time expressions. During one holiday season, I was considering this. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Thompson, she sat down and told me this. When I told her such and such, she advised me this. As a result, obviously shows a cause and effect relationship. And again, a contrast to what the three companies' stock prices experienced. We also have adequate support in this paragraph. Not only does the writer talk about the two types of influences, the professional and the financial influence that Mrs. Dana Thompson has had on her life, but she explains it very clearly with two specific anecdotal experiences. One about being offered another job as a vacuum cleaner salesperson, and another situation about her decision on what to do with her holiday bonus money. Of course, as we mentioned before, the topic sentence is clearly stated at the beginning of the paragraph, and even a concluding sentence at the end is provided to wrap up the ideas in the paragraph. Taking a look at another example, this is another paragraph which shows effective development. I had a terrible day at work yesterday, a day which has caused me to rethink my professional goals. Here we have a clear topic sentence. Let's see how the paragraph develops itself. First, when I came into the office, my supervisor told me that I had missed a meeting with our project manager. I responded that I had had no idea of this meeting. However, my supervisor pointed to it on the electronic calendar. Unfortunately, the meeting cannot be posted onto my electronic calendar until the previous day at 4:45 p.m., a point that I made to my supervisor. Nonetheless, she informed me that it was my duty to check my electronic calendar from home before coming to work, so that I can make sure I know what appointments may have been made for that day. I was embarrassed to receive this correction. We see that the word first marks that to the reader that this is the first example of why this is such a terrible day. The event is explained in chronological order, in a logical fashion, and a concluding remark is made. I was embarrassed to receive this correction. Later, now we see the next example. When I went to lunch with two other colleagues, the president of the company saw us on the elevator. I noticed him frowning at me. When I got off the elevator a minute later, I noticed that my pants were unzipped. I was extremely embarrassed. I decided to email him later that day to apologize for my unprofessional manner of dress. So we have another chronological or time order explanation of something that happened, and it happened later in the day, which is why the writer puts it second. Of course, this event happened first thing in the morning. This event happened perhaps a few hours later. Unfortunately, I inadvertently emailed our whole department in my apology. Several members came to my office later, forgiving me for leaving my pants unzipped. My level of shame was at an all-time high by now. So we can see the writer transitioning to the third unfortunate incident on this day, using a bit of humor as he describes it, and concluding with, my level of shame was at an all-time high by now. Then we have another transition expression. Just as I thought the day's antics would end, I went to the printer at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to pick up a printout and noticed that the printer had jammed. So here, again, we have the third incident happening after the incident on the elevator, and the fourth incident happening at 4. We have our events described in chronological or time order. The first described first, the second event described second, the third event described third, and the last event described last. I looked around the machine and noticed a slot that seemed removable. I jerked on it and heard plastic cracking. Then I observed a black handle fall to the floor. The printer would not function. The secretary immediately turned around and winced. She reminded me that paper jams were to be dealt with by her. She then picked up the phone and called the printer technician, who told her he would not be able to come to fix the printer until the following week. 3 people in the office then glared at me, wordlessly expressing their discontent at my sabotaging of the printing process in our office. We have this explained with appropriate transition words as well. I did this, then I did this. The secretary immediately turned around. She reminded me of this. She then picked up the phone. 3 people then glared at me. So words like then indicate a transition from one event to another. In conclusion, I was glad to leave the office that day. In addition, I have considered changing fields and going into construction work. In that line of work, one does not deal with meetings, formalities of dress, or printer mishaps. In this concluding sentence, the writer reflects what had already been stated throughout the paragraph and what had already been introduced in the topic sentence. In addition, in the concluding sentence, the writer talks about meetings, formalities of dress, and printer mishaps, the very incidents that are described in the paragraph itself. We have another well-developed paragraph.